When Karen arrived at my driveway with her HOA-issued paperwork and a gleam of triumph in her eyes, she was convinced she'd finally cornered me. She declared my excessive vehicles a violation of neighborhood regulations, stating that fines would be imposed immediately for disrupting the community's aesthetic. But Karen didn't realize her outrageous claim would expose a truth she couldn't handle, that I wasn't just a homeowner in this neighborhood. I owned the entire block. As her sleek SUV rolled to a stop in front of my house, Karen strutted to my door. She didn't waste any time. "Jake, I'm here to inform you that the HOA has decided to increase your fees," Karen stated, her tone flat and authoritative. "Your vehicles are in violation of the regulations. Too many cars on your property, it disrupts the neighborhood standard." I raised an eyebrow. "You're increasing my fees because I park cars on land I own?" Karen adjusted her clipboard, clearly pleased with herself. "It's all outlined in the bylaws. There's a limit of 2 vehicles per household. This decision is final, and you'll need to comply immediately." Her confidence was almost amusing. I stepped back and crossed my arms, letting a small laugh escape. "Karen, I own the entire neighborhood." For the first time, her posture faltered. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," I said, watching the realization start to sink in. "Every house, every driveway, every street you're trying to enforce fees on cars parked on land I own. You might want to rethink your approach." Karen stood frozen for a moment, unable to hide the confusion on her face. She flipped through her clipboard, searching for something to regain control of the conversation. It was clear the rules she was relying on weren't going to hold up this time. Call to action. Drop your city below. We want to see how far this story has reached. The first time I met Karen was during an HOA meeting. I had just moved in, eager to introduce myself and get a feel for the community. As I stepped into the meeting room, Karen's voice was the first thing I heard, sharp, commanding about someone's trash bins being left out a full hour past collection time. She stopped mid-sentence when she noticed me and immediately made a beeline in my direction, clipboard in hand. "You must be the new resident," she said, skipping any pleasantries. "Jake, is it? Have you read the HOA bylaws yet? They're mandatory for maintaining order around here. Your lawn needs to be mowed no longer than 2 inches, and I noticed your grass is already pushing that limit," she said with a pointed glance toward the direction of my house. "And those boxes on your porch? We don't tolerate clutter, it's an eyesore." Her tone wasn't helpful. It was accusatory, as though she expected me to defend myself for moving in. When I mentioned I'd only just unpacked, she cut me off with a curt, "The rules apply to everyone. I'll be watching to make sure things are in compliance by next week." It was less of a welcome and more of a warning. And I left that meeting with a sinking feeling that Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was someone I'd have to deal with for a long time. And now Karen tried to cut me off, but I opened the folder and began distributing copies of the documents I'd been collecting for years. Property maps, purchase agreements, and a detailed list of every house I owned in the neighborhood. By the time I finished handing them out, the tension in the room had reached its peak. "Madam President," I said, turning back to Karen with a calm but pointed look, "you've been targeting me and my family for months over these supposed vehicle violations. But what you failed to realize is that my real estate investment company owns 67% of this development." Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words to regain control. "What are you talking about?" she stammered, her voice losing its edge. "I own this neighborhood," I repeated, letting the weight of my words sink in. "Every house, every street, every driveway, including the property of several families you fined and harassed without justification." The room erupted in whispers, neighbors flipping through the documents and murmuring their disbelief. Karen's confidence cracked, her hands trembling as she shuffled through her clipboard. "This is outrageous," she shouted, slamming her gavel on the podium. "You can't just buy a neighborhood and ignore the rules." "I'm not ignoring anything, Karen," I replied coolly. "I've followed every HOA bylaw, documented every instance of selective enforcement, and attended every meeting through proxies, of course. What I haven't done is use my position to harass my neighbors or abuse my power. Can you say the same?" Karen's face turned red, her indignation now fully on display. She turned to her husband Bob, who was sitting off to the side, but he looked as stunned as the rest of the audience. I glanced at the neighbors sitting around me, many of whom had been victims of Karen's petty tactics. For years, you've lived under Karen's HOA, rules the fines, the notices, the constant inspections. But now you have a choice. This bylaw is just another way to control you, to dictate how you live your lives in your own homes. You don't have to stand for it anymore. A cheer erupted from the back of the room, followed by claps and shouts of agreement. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up, shaking her head as she addressed Karen directly. "You fined me for letting my grandson park in my driveway to fix my roof, Karen. What kind of leadership is that?" Mr. Chen added, "You sent me a violation notice for parking my car over the line during a snowstorm. This is ridiculous." The tide was turning, and Karen knew it. She banged her gavel again, but this time, the noise did little to calm the rising wave of dissent. Neighbors stood one by one, voicing their frustrations and calling out Karen's abuses of power. As the meeting spiraled out of Karen's control, I sat back, watching the chaos unfold. The stack of documents in my folder had been the spark, but the years of pent-up frustration were the fuel. Karen had underestimated her neighbors for too long, and now she was facing the consequences. When the crowd finally settled, Howard one of the quieter board members stood up and addressed Karen directly. "I think it's time we reevaluate the HOA leadership," he said firmly. "This community deserves better than arbitrary fines and personal vendettas." Karen tried to protest, but the writing was on the wall. Her grip on the neighborhood was slipping, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I left the meeting that night knowing the neighborhood was finally starting to wake up. Karen had played her cards, but she'd failed to consider the possibility of losing. And as I walked back to my car, my wife and daughter waiting for me at home, I felt a sense of victory not just for myself, but for everyone who'd endured years of Karen's reign. The HOA would never be the same again. Karen stood rigid behind the podium, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges like they were the only things keeping her standing. The tension in the room was palpable, broken only by the flickering projector as damning evidence unfolded slide by slide. The neighbors weren't whispering anymore, they were outright voicing their disgust, their anger swelling with each new revelation. Karen tried to maintain her composure, but her face was betraying her, her expression shifting from indignant fury to outright panic. Her gavel sat abandoned on the floor where she had dropped it earlier, its hollow clatter forgotten amidst the chaos. For a moment, she reached down, as though retrieving it might somehow restore her authority, but the damage had already been done. I flipped to another slide, letting the projector light up the wall with images of Karen's backyard renovation, the pristine patio, the expensive landscaping, and the sparkling hot tub. It was a stark contrast to the public pool, which remained untouched despite the missing $50,000 supposedly allocated for repairs. "Karen," I said, my voice steady, cutting through the tense silence. "Maybe you'd like to explain to everyone where the funds went. Or should I go ahead and show the invoices that lead back to your contractor?" "2. Don't know anything about those invoices," Karen stammered, her tone desperate. Her hand reached for the water bottle on the podium, but her grip was so unsteady that it tipped over, spilling onto her blouse. The neighbors murmured louder now, a sea of disbelief and discontent sweeping through the room. "Really?" I countered, clicking to the next slide. The projector now displayed the scanned bank statement, Karen's name glaring in bold next to the suspicious $10,000 maintenance fee deposited into her personal account. The room erupted. "You said we couldn't afford new streetlights," Mrs. Johnson cried out from the corner, her voice trembling with emotion. "You lied to us, Karen. You lied to all of us." Karen's voice grew shrill, the veneer of politeness fully stripped away. "This is slander," she screeched, banging her fists on the podium. "You have no proof. None of this is true." I clicked to the final slidey, a time-stamped video from my security cameras showing Karen sneaking around my property at 3 a.m., ruler in hand, measuring my grass under the glare of motion-activated lights. The absurdity of the footage sent ripples of laughter and gasps through the audience. "Proof, Karen?" I said, raising an eyebrow. There's more than enough proof here to put your entire presidency under scrutiny." Karen's face twisted into a mix of rage and panic as she scanned the room for allies. "I did what was necessary to keep this neighborhood." "Necessary?" Bob Chen interrupted, standing up and slamming his hand on the table. "By stealing from us? By fining us for nonsense and letting your friends off scot-tangent-free? That's your definition of leadership?" Karen turned to her husband, Bob, her desperation apparent, but he stared down at his hands, clearly unwilling to meet her gaze, let alone come to her defense. One by one, neighbors stood, their voices rising in frustration and fury. "You fined me $200 for snowdrifts from my car. You sent me a violation notice for my granddaughter's toys in the yard. You threatened me with legal action over an outdoor grill." Karen banged her fists on the podium again, her voice cracking. "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked. "I don't have to listen to this mob mentality." I stepped forward, my tone calm but cutting. "Actually, Karen, according to HOA bylaws section 7.3, a majority vote is required to adjourn a meeting. And judging by the hands in the air, I'd say you don't have that majority anymore." Karen froze, her hand halfway to the doorknob, her power slipping through her fingers. The board members who had once been her loyal allies now sat silent, their gazes fixed firmly on the floor. She glanced at the deeds spread across the table, the undeniable proof that her reign as HOA president had just come to an end. As I gestured to the news cameras outside, her face grew pale. She hadn't noticed them until now, the hum of the reporters preparing for live coverage cutting through the room like a guillotine. Karen sank against the wall, her shoulders slumping, the realization hitting her like a tidal wave. The meeting had ended, but Karen wasn't done. The next morning, I woke up to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. It was another violation, this time for unauthorized landscaping debris. My jaw tightened as I read the absurd claim. Apparently, the branches I had legally returned to her yard were now considered a neighborhood hazard. Karen was doubling down, using every ounce of her remaining influence to make my life miserable. But this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood. She was trying to reassert her control, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Then Karen marched over to them, her voice loud enough for me to hear. "I want this done by the end of the day," she snapped. "And make sure it's visible from his property. He needs to understand that this is my neighborhood." I frowned, trying to piece together what she was planning. The workers began unloading materials, wooden stakes, rolls of fencing, and even a small cement mixer. It didn't take long to realize she was building something, a barrier perhaps, or some kind of petty display meant to provoke me. By evening, the construction was complete. Karen had erected a towering fence along the edge of her property, painted in a garish shade of neon pink. It was an eyesore, deliberately designed to clash with the rest of the neighborhood's aesthetic. But the worst part? She had mounted signs on the fence, each one bearing a message aimed directly at me. "Keep your trash out of my yard. Respect HOA rules. This is not your kingdom." I stared at the monstrosity, my blood boiling. Karen had crossed the line yet again, turning her yard into a billboard for her vendetta. The neighbors began gathering, murmuring among themselves as they took in the spectacle. Mrs. Johnson shook her head, her voice trembling. "She's gone too far this time, Jake. This isn't just petty, it's harassment." I nodded, my jaw clenched. "She wants a fight? Fine, she'll get one." I spent the next few hours planning my response, determined to put an end to Karen's antics once and for all. This wasn't just about tearing down her ridiculous fence, it was about exposing her for the tyrant she truly was. I started by gathering evidence photos of the fence, copies of the violation notices she had issued, and statements from neighbors who had been targeted by her petty rules. Then, I called my lawyer, outlining my plan to escalate the situation legally and publicly. The next morning, I rented a bulldozer. It arrived in my driveway, its bright yellow frame gleaming in the sunlight. Karen watched from her porch, her expression shifting from smug satisfaction to wary curiosity. She had no idea what was coming. I spent the day collecting branches and debris from my yard, loading them into the bulldozer's scoop. Each piece felt like a small victory, a tangible step toward reclaiming my dignity and the neighborhood's freedom. By the time the scoop was full, I was ready to make my move. Karen stood frozen as I drove the bulldozer toward her fence, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice cracking. I stopped the bulldozer just short of the fence, stepping out and meeting her gaze. "Returning the favor, Karen," I said calmly. "You wanted to escalate? Fine. Let's escalate." The branches tumbled over the fence with a satisfying crunch, landing in her yard like a pile of justice. Karen's face turned red as she screamed, her voice echoing across the neighborhood. "You can't do this! This is illegal!" I crossed my arms, unbothered by her theatrics. "Funny, Karen. That's exactly what I thought when you built this eyesore without consulting the HOA. But don't worry, I've documented everything." Her hands were trembling as she slammed them against the podium, her gavel long forgotten on the floor. A wave of murmurs swept through the room as neighbors exchanged wary looks. No one had ever seen her lose control like this before. "Karen, no one's ganging up on you," I said, my tone deliberately calm but firm, stepping closer to the front. "We're holding you accountable. There's a difference." She turned her glare on me, her eyes wide with panic and rage. "Accountable? Accountable? For what exactly, Jake? For enforcing the rules? For keeping this neighborhood from falling into chaos?" She pointed a shaking finger at me, her voice rising to a near shriek. "You're nothing but a manipulator trying to twist everyone against me." I held up my hand, unfazed by her theatrics. "Karen, no one here needs me to twist anything. Your actions speak for themselves." I gestured toward the projector screen, which was still displaying the evidence of her misdeeds. "You've fined people for nonsense. You've used HOA funds to renovate your own backyard, and you've treated this community like your personal kingdom. That's not leadership." Her face turned a deep shade of crimson. "Lies, all lies," she spat. "You're just jealous because you've never respected the rules, Jake. You think you're above everyone else." Before I could respond, Mrs. Johnson stood up, her voice trembling with anger. "Karen, how dare you? I've lived here for 40 years, and I've never seen anyone abuse their power like you have. You fined me for not shoveling my walkway while I was in the hospital. Do you think that's leadership?" Karen's head snapped toward Mrs. Johnson, her expression hardening. "You don't understand how hard it is to keep this neighborhood running. Someone has to make the tough decisions. I've sacrificed my time, my energy, everything for this community, and this is the thanks I get?" Mr. Chen stood next, his voice steady but sharp. "Tough decisions? Like fining people for snowdrifts? Like tracking every car that comes into our driveways? Karen, this isn't leadership, it's a dictatorship." Karen's grip on the podium tightened as the room buzzed with whispers and accusations. Her once commanding presence was now reduced to a trembling figure, desperately trying to salvage her authority. But the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. The evidence was overwhelming, and her reign was crumbling before her eyes. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the chaos. "Karen, you've spent years using this HOA to bully and intimidate your neighbors. You've fined widows, harassed teachers, and stolen from the community to fund your own backyard renovations. But tonight, it ends." Karen's face turned pale, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. "This is a witch hunt!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You're all just jealous of my success." "Success?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Is that what you call stealing $50,000 from the HOA fund? Or measuring grass at 3 a.m.? Because I call it abuse of power." I clicked to the next slide on the projector, revealing a detailed timeline of Karen's actions, every fine, every violation notice, every suspicious fee. The neighbors leaned forward, their anger palpable as they read through the list. Mrs. Johnson stood up, her voice trembling with emotion. "Last winter, you fined me $200 for not shoveling my walkway fast enough. I was in the hospital with pneumonia, Karen. How could you be so cruel?" Karen tried to respond, but her words were drowned out by the rising voices of the crowd. "Mr. Chen added, "You sent me a violation notice for parking my car over the line during a snowstorm. Do you have any idea how hard it is to park when the driveway is covered in ice?" The room erupted in agreement, neighbors standing one by one to share their stories. Karen's attempts to restore order were futile. Her gavel lay forgotten on the floor, and her clipboard was no longer a shield. I stepped closer to the podium, my voice calm but firm. Karen, you've spent years hiding behind this HOA, pretending to be a leader while exploiting your position for personal gain. But tonight, the truth is out, and it's time for you to face the consequences. Karen's husband, Bob, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, finally stood up. Karen, maybe it's time to step down, he said, his voice low. This isn't worth it anymore. Karen turned to him, her face a mix of shock and betrayal. You're supposed to support me, she hissed. But Bob simply shook his head and walked out of the room, leaving her alone to face the crowd.